Hi. Hi, Kamal. Hi, Lauren. Welcome to tonight's pre-prep hour. Excited to have you here. Um, in the past recently, I have been doing these as kind of open Q&A sessions, but I'm actually going to do more of a structured lesson today, at least for the first part of time. So if anyone came wanting a Q&A, there will be some Q&A time, but I want to talk about kind of an important issue, which is timing. Hi, Luis. Hi, Shirley. Welcome. And I think that's going to be the big focus of maybe the first like at least half hour of tonight's session is just talking about how to manage time, how to get better at timing, how to practice timing, because I think it's such an important skill. And I've been thinking about it a lot. So I was like, let me do a little bit of a presentation about timing today. And then we'll probably have some time to do question and answer, right? So please also bring, bring other questions that you have and we'll discuss. Great. Oh, we have a good group here today. So I think to start, I would just love to know from everyone. I have some specific questions related to our topic. And then also we're going to mostly communicate in the chat. If you could all just say hi in the chat and let me know a couple of things, right? Let me know, where are you? If you feel like it. I'm in New York. I'm in Brooklyn. It's nice here. It was really hot here in this early summer. Now it's pleasant. It's kind of fall-like today. Where are you geographically? What part of your GRE process are you in? And then anything to share specifically about timing. If you're new, have you taken a practice test? What was your experience with timing on that? In general, how are you dealing with, or just, what challenges are you facing with managing time? Because that's going to be our big topic tonight. And I'm going to talk about it maybe for 30 minutes-ish. We'll see what questions everyone has, and then we'll have some open Q&A time toward the end too. I think, depending on how much time everything takes. Sometimes I was thinking about also maybe doing a live timed set demo, but if I do that, I think I'll do that in my next free prep hour. I don't think I'm going to do it tonight. Awesome. Yay. So say hi in the chat. Let us know. You can let me know. You can chat just me, but where are you? What part of your GRE process are you in? Are you just starting out? Are you really close to test day? It's an interesting time of year because people can be in very different parts of the process. Business school round 1 is soon, but there's round 2. There's lots of other programs. So I would love to hear a little bit about where you are in your GRE studies, and if you could share in the chat. We're going to have a small group, which is nice. One of the nice things about these free prep hours is they've been attracting nice small groups, so I'm able to often get everybody's questions answered as well. So also be thinking about what questions you might have to ask more broadly once we're done with the timing. Oh, Shirley, I'm also in Brooklyn. Yay. Cool. Geometry is a big one. There's a lot of geometry. So if you have, and geometry is a major portion of the test, right? So if you have the geometry, having the geometry and exponent rules down is good, because sometimes I work with people close to test day, and those are 2 big areas of memorization. And in terms of the calculations part, right? That's something where I would get like a times table app. I would get some kind of math game. Duolingo has some stuff now too, but I think it might be a little basic. But I would get some kind of math game to play. The other game that I used to play, because my arithmetic's really bad and it gives me a lot of anxiety. When I first started teaching, I had a lot of fear about doing arithmetic in front of other people. And something I used to do is every time I saw a license plate or a phone number, I would multiply and then add all the numbers in it. And it actually really helped the calculation side of things. So that's an interesting challenge. It's not always one that can shift super fast, but I'd imagine in the span of weeks, that's something if you do, 10 minutes a day with just focusing on the calculation and drill side of things might be helpful. Cool. And then Emma, you're in the totally other side. You're just starting. Great. Well, hopefully some of the things I have to talk about with timing today, I have some tips that I think will be helpful for people who are close to the test, but I also think some of the stuff I have to say might help you just in terms of planning the arc of your studies and thinking about what the study process is like if you're newer. Uh, yeah, I think I got a message about switching from GMAT to GRE. I'm happy to talk more specifically about that later today too. But I think a lot of time, almost every time someone's been thinking about it, it's been good. If you haven't taken a practice GRE yet, I would do that. I think that will probably give you a lot of clarity about the switch. I think the timing strategy is easier to manage on the GRE. I don't teach GMAT in part because I have a hard time with managing the question adaptive strategy. And I think the section adaptive format on the GRE is much easier to manage strategically. Plus all the math and, a lot of the math content and the reading stuff that you've done for GMAT will transfer to GRE. Yeah, yep. And then also we're going to talk specifically about timing with reading comp because for sure, everyone has the pace they read at. And I think we each therefore need to find a way of dealing with this test that works for the pace that we have to read at. And I'll talk a lot about that. But if you feel that you are a slow reader, I've worked with lots of people who are and who've been very successful in the test. So it's more about, sort of accepting what your natural reading speed is and then developing strategies to work with it. And I've seen all different, I've seen people who have all different types of dyslexia be successful with the verbal side. I've seen people with all different types of reading speeds, all different types of relationships to reading. So it's definitely doable. Verbal takes a little more time sometimes than quant because it's complicated. But yeah, we're going to talk specifically about that issue of reading speed and reading comp. New Jersey, you're close by. Yeah. Um, and Lauren, I would also think about questions in groups, right? Because I think with individual questions, it's, there is some variation. And then you may also find, right, that like you mentioned verbal, the sentence equivalence in particular. I find that for me, right, there's sort of some standard benchmarks for how much time each type of question should take, and we can talk about those. But I find that each person's a little different. Like for me, I'm very slow at quantitative comparison. So I take way more time than is advised on quantitative comparison. But then I am a lot faster with the non-quantitative comparison. So I kind of compensate in that way. So if you're noticing there's a particular question format where your timing is not what you want it to be, also we're thinking about, are there other types of questions in that section? Like maybe some of your reading comp can adjust to accommodate the sentence equivalence timing stuff. And then sometimes in verbal, we have to slow ourselves down. And that's something we can talk about today too. If you find you're finishing things early, but you're not you're not as accurate as you want to be. Sometimes it's about finding techniques to be a little slower, a little steadier. I think especially in verbal, it's often for me and for a lot of folks I work with, not everyone though, it's better in verbal to get it right the first time because I think it's the rare person who can rethink their choices in verbal effectively. People can do it. I've seen people do it, but I know it's not me because I think once I get locked into sort of a certain decision in verbal, it's hard for me to go back. Cool. That was all super helpful. If you haven't shared yet, please do. I would love to know a little bit more about everyone. Awesome. Yeah, topics to emphasize in quant. If you are taking the GRE next week, that's a great question, Kamal. I would emphasize stats, geometry. There's a lot of stats and a lot of geometry on the new test. Algebra and number properties. Those I think are the four, and I include like fractions, decimals, and percents in stats, but those are the four kind of biggest, most frequent areas in the new test. Awesome. Cool. And then in the last week, right, the best thing that you can do is rest and take good care of yourself because in the last week and to sort of fine tune, test a game plan and strategy and stuff. But in that last week, you're not going to necessarily build a ton of new skill. You can cram content for sure, but maybe not build skill as effectively in 1 week. But if you are rested and well, you're gonna have the best odds of performing the way you want to perform. Cool. Stats, geometry, number properties, and algebra. Yeah. And I'm including fractions, decimals, and percents with stats, but you could think of that also as sort of a separate extension of it. All right. Please, as we go tonight, I'm going to talk for a little bit. I'm going to kind of do a lecture on timing. And as I do, please continue to ask questions. If it's a question that's not directly relevant to what I'm talking about, I may save it for later when we do an open Q&A. But definitely anything I'm talking about as we go, throw stuff in the chat and ask. Cool. So I just want to go through a few kind of principles of how to think about timing on the test. We're going to start with some general things, then we'll shift into talking about how to practice timing and how to build these skills. So the most important thing I can tell you about timing is, unless you are currently scoring above 160 and aiming for a very high score, right? 165 plus is very high because this test is on a normal distribution curve, right? So they design it so that only, a very small percentage of people get that scores that high. You should not be trying to do every problem. One of the biggest things that I do in my work is I sit with people and I try to convince them that they should not be trying to do every single problem. So if you are not at your goal score in quant and you're not, if you're not above 160 and aiming for a very high score, right? If you're anywhere else in the process, you can probably gain a lot of points in your score. You can probably boost your score and solve a chunk of your timing issues simply by allowing yourself to quickly guess and bail on maybe 1 to 4 problems in each section. And the exact number is going to depend a little bit on which section is it. Is it the first or second, where you're scoring, where you want to be scoring? That's a very individual thing, exactly how many questions. But a great thing that you can do when you review a practice test is to go through, right, and figure out, reviewing a practice test, redo every problem you missed, and sort them into 2 buckets. What can you do? What can't you do yet? Trying to figure out where do you have skill, but you're not executing. And that's often like a timing strategy process, small error written work kind of issue. Or where do you need to build skill? Now, if you're new in the process, there may be a lot of problems that you can't do yet. And that's totally fine because you're going to study and build skill. But if you're in the last, if you're in the last month even of your process, when you get that bucket of problems that you can't do yet, there may just always be a couple. I still find I've been doing this for 9 years. I've taken the test many times. And I still find that there's usually at least one quant question that I just, the last time I took the GRE last November, when I took the short format test, there was just one geometry problem I couldn't do. And it drove me nuts. I'm clearly still thinking about it because I think I'm good at geometry. And I was very upset that I couldn't do this problem. But there's still one. And this is, I do GRE almost every day. And I've done GRE almost every day for 9 years. So there's just going to be stuff that's not a good use of your time to do. And what you want to do is you want to spot those problems quickly, not sink a lot of time into them. Take that extra, 90, 120 seconds that you get by not doing that problem and invest it on having a very high accuracy on the things that are comfortably within your skill set in that moment. I'm going to talk a little bit about how you spot these problems that you shouldn't do. Any problem that meets some combination of these criteria, right? So when I'm thinking about, is this a problem that I should do in this moment? And it's a moment, it changes, right? If I'm very tired or very stressed, the problems that I'm not going to do are going to be a little different than if I'm feeling really good or I'm really calm. So if I look at a problem and I'm like, I think I can do this, but I'm just going to have to test 50 numbers, right? I was talking about this with the students this afternoon. If it's like just a ton of testing numbers, then I'm like, cool, I'm going to guess, I'm going to mark it. I'm going to get what else I can get in the section. And then I'll come back if I have time. Maybe I have 2 minutes left and I can sink it into it. But I don't want to sink those, 3 minutes of testing numbers into a problem in the middle of a section. And then maybe I miss, two questions at the end or even 3 questions at the end that would have been easier wins for me. So anything that's going to look at it and I know my solution path is going to be long, or it's going to be, a method that's not good, like testing a lot or, just thinking a ton. If it is a level of difficulty and or a topic that I know is not good for me, right? So there's certain levels of probability and combinatorics that I just don't like to do. So I have a rule. If I see a probability and combinatorics question and it is not a scenario that I'm familiar with, then I'm not going to do it because I know that for me, trying to work out a new probability or combinatorics sort of pattern live under pressure in a time setting is not good. So I don't want to stress myself with that. And then the other thing that I'm also thinking about as I'm making these decisions going through a time set or through a section or through a full test is what's my level of activation at that moment? Because for so many of us, I think stress, anxiety, nerves, this causes a lot of problems, with having to do this type of problem solving. So for example, if I start the test, I'm usually quite anxious when I start. So if I see that first problem and there's anything about that first problem makes my anxiety spike. It's a topic I don't like. It's a level of complexity I don't like. It's something that doesn't look like something I've seen before. I'm going to go straight to the next question. And I'm going to start with a question that's going to settle my energy. So then when I'm a little calmer, maybe I go back to that other question, or maybe I don't, maybe I go forward. But I always want to be making choices that are also helping to manage my stress level as I'm going through the test. So that's one thing that is, I think, that's something I think that's also changed a lot as I've done this for many years is like I come to see that decision making around not just using time, but also using energy, attention, and like kind of self-management resources is a huge part of managing time. Absolutely not, right? All that matters for your score, I got a question, is it bad for our score to skip the first question? In GMAT it might, but in GRE it doesn't. All that matters is the number of questions that you get right in that section. So by skipping the first, and sometimes I'll skip the first 2, or maybe I skip the first 3. I want to start on a win. Because if I start on something that's stressing me out, and I'm already a little stressed because it's the beginning of the test and I have a little adrenaline spike, then what's going to happen is it's going to snowball. And we're going to see maybe, I often, when I look at practice test data, right, I see strings of incorrect problems, often where, I know that that person could do a lot of those questions because there's that one question that they spiral on and it sets off this chain reaction, especially at the beginning of the section. So absolutely, like, you don't lose points for wrong answers. So just guessing, always guess, could be a win. And it doesn't matter where in the section you have questions that are wrong or right. It's just the total number that are wrong or right in the section. This is also something you absolutely have to practice a lot, right? I get the question a lot, like, how do I know which problems to skip? And if I could, if I could give everyone like a list to memorize, I would, I always am in quest of like the simplest and easiest answers because I really want all of us to spend the least amount of time with the GRE possible that we have to, get our scores and move on to better things. But you really do have to learn this a little bit through practice because it's a little bit different for everyone. So and I'll talk about how to do time set practice today, but really doing a lot of time sets and just noticing what works for you is enormously important. And I would probably keep some notes, right? Like I would keep maybe a list or a spreadsheet or a journal, whatever format works for you, where you just at the end of each time set reflect, like, did I skip the right one? Did I not? How do I know? The other thing that is enormously important, not just for making good timing choices, but also for having successful problem solving processes, is that you don't rush into doing the math part. You don't rush into going back to the passage and finding proof. You give yourself time and space to process the question fully before deciding on your approach. This is very hard, I think, when we're under time pressure because we want to be doing as soon as possible because that feels like we're moving forward. But training yourself to be slow at the start is so good for long. This is one of those things where like when I get someone to make this adjustment, it often creates a huge jump in performance. So I always begin, what is it asking? Where do I start? And then is this a topic or a question type or level of difficulty that I know is an issue for me? And that's, at that 15 to 30-second mark, that's ideally when I make the decision. Am I going to invest in this problem or am I going to save this problem for later? I'm going to guess maybe I mark it to come back to and move on. A really good exercise, set a timer for 30 seconds. No work until the timer goes off. Just on sort of individual problems, right? For individual problem practice. But this is a great way to train yourself to be a little slower in the beginning, to notice. This is also what will allow you to choose more efficient solution paths too. So really, really helpful shift in problem solving. Also really important for making good timing choices. And the reason why I've started calling them low value problems is it's not necessarily that it's a problem that you can't do, or it's not necessarily it's a problem that's like, you should. I think people sometimes get caught up in like, I should be able to do this and it's just not working, or, oh, I studied this and I should be able to do it. It doesn't matter. It's more a choice of like, is this a good use of my resources in this moment? And I think I renamed them low value problems because I think sometimes also our emotions get in the way of our making good timing choices. We'll get really stubborn about like, oh, I've got to be able to do this. And you have nothing to prove to any individual problem, right? It's really about how you manage the time and the stress and the attention and all of your internal resources over the course of the whole test. I already ended up talking about this, but I'm going to come back to it. Don't start with a struggle, right? Let yourself begin each section with a win. Then you can go back and fill in the stuff that you skipped over. But it just helps enormously in terms of staying steady, in terms of having good energy, good accuracy throughout the section. Now, yes, when I say skip, I always mean guess and move on. Never leave a question blank. Absolutely. Yep. I mark a question. Yeah. So I'm gonna take a second to emphasize that because that's a really important point with timing strategy and a really excellent question. I always fill in an answer before I move on. It can be truly a guess, right? I would have a simple decision rule for guessing. Like I'm always gonna pick C because it's the first letter of my first name or something, whatever it is, so that you aren't kind of hesitating over that because you just want to fill something in and go forward. And then for marking, I mark if I think that I could do it with some time, like this is doable, but not right now. I don't mark if I know it's not doable, right? Like it's a crazy hard combinatorics and I know I don't like combinatorics. It's a cylinder problem and I know I don't remember volume of cylinder. Then I don't mark it. But I like the marking because I think it also helps me to let go because I'm like, oh, I'm not giving up. I'm just saving it for later. And for some reason, that's like a good psychic trick for me because I'm very stubborn. Timing choices are actually in some ways most important. I'm sorry, I was just pausing to look at my typo. I have a big issues with small errors, and that's something I think a lot about when I'm teaching the GRE. If you do fall behind, right? So I think mostly people make their big timing mistakes in the first half of the section because that's when we have a lot of time on the clock and we're maybe going to overinvest in things we shouldn't, and then they get rushed in the second half. Very, very common. one way to fix this is to be a little bit more aggressive about letting things go in the first half of the section, and that comes with practice. The other thing, though, is if you do fall behind in time, the big mistake is to compound the error by starting to try to do everything faster. If I get halfway through the section and I notice that I'm really off where I want to be in time, right? What I'm going to do, I'm going to take a deep breath. I'm going to close my eyes for a second, going to settle myself because I know my impulse is not the right one. My impulse is to panic and do things fast. And I'm just going to be honest with myself. All right, I've got 8 problems left, and I've got, maybe I've got 8 problems left and I've got 8 minutes. I can do 4 quant problems in 8 minutes because I know I average about 2 minutes per quant problem. So I'm going to look at that and I'm going to say, great, I am going to get 4 of those 8 questions right. And that's going to be good. That's the best I can do with this situation. And in a lot of cases, that could be enough to get you where you want to be. And so then I'm going to go through and I'm going to really be more aggressive about saying, okay, let me only do problems that I feel are sure wins. I'm going to skip a lot more aggressively. I'm going to guess and mark a lot more aggressively because I know that I really only have time probably to execute 4 of these accurately. The big issue is if you're like, I have 8 minutes left and I have 8 problems and I'm going to spend 1 minute on each problem, and then it's going to be very rushed and, maybe I'll get lucky and someone will be right. But I would much prefer to have that sure 4 out of 8 than to kind of fly through 8 and end up with like 1 out of 8. In general, too. Yeah, it's absolutely like the perfectionist stuff is so real. And it absolutely can be a big challenge with the timings. It's helpful. It's helpful with not making slides with small errors, but yeah, that's a big part of it for sure. The other thing too is like if anyone has ever done any kind of distance running, I think there's something similar where one of the things you want to learn in time to practice is what's a good pace for you, right? What's a good pace to read at? What's a good pace to do math at? What's that steady, consistent pace that you work at when you're doing things in a way that's accurate and successful for you? Get a feel for that. And then that's another reason why I think it's good to start in a win is you can start with a problem that allows you to lock into that pace, and then you can keep that pace in the way, like if you're a runner, you're like, I'm going to do, let's say a 7-minute mile, and I know what that feels like in my body, and I'm going to establish that and stick with that in the race. Ideally, right? Always things get a little bit more chaotic when we're in the official test situation. It's always been my experience, at least. But ideally, that's the aim and that's the goal. This brings me to what I promised. We're specifically going to talk about reading. And this is where I think, reading strategy is where there's a lot more variation. There's always variation. Each brain, each test taker is different. But in quant, there's a little bit more, I think, of a standard practice. And reading, it truly is a bit different for everyone. And one of the things is to accept the pace that you read at and to practice reading at a pace that allows you to comfortably comprehend. Trying to read too fast is one of those things that makes everything worse, because then you're adding a lot of stress because you're sort of pushing your brain to move in a way that it probably doesn't like. You add stress, you're going to have a harder time with the questions, more likely to fall into traps. Everything kind of compounds. The other thing that is important for everyone is that we all try to read too fast when we read on screens. It's one of the reasons why we don't remember and comprehend things that we read on screens as well as we do things that we read on paper, which is also something, if you're starting and you're like learning quant strategies, do a paper book. Yes, you want to eventually get used to working off the screen, but to start, do it on paper because you're going to learn that content better. So for all of us, I think when we're reading for this test, we're actually probably going to be reading at a pace that feels slightly slow for what our natural speed is, to offset that screen effect of wanting to read too fast. One of the most, in my little toolbox of like single interventions that produce great results, another one of them is having people spend more time on reading the passage and then becoming more efficient on the questions. And it's not true for everybody, but many people, probably the majority of people that I've worked with over the years, benefit from taking a little bit more time in reading the passage. Doesn't mean you're trying to fully comprehend every sentence of the passage, right? We're aiming always for like 40 to 80% understanding of the text, but that you are getting solid in what you need to get solid in before you move into the questions. We'll talk about this in timing practice too, when we talk about timing practice. But then the trick is you want to become more efficient in the questions. So a really good way to become more efficient in reading prompt, to make time to allow yourself to read at the speed that you should, should comfortably be reading at for you, is to do, to analyze really kind of thoroughly, deeply a lot of reading prompt questions. I would go through all of the ETS official guide, the verbal supplement, and just have this mindset of I'm going to know all the ETS, all the published ETS verbal material, right? I'm going to know inside and out. And take your time. I've had a student who had a lot of success in bringing their verbal score from 150s up into the 160s, which can be a hard transition. And I asked them about it, and they said one of the things they felt was most helpful was they just redid reading questions and read them multiple times and came back to them and repeated them until they felt like they really understood the underlying structure and pattern of the question and answers. And then, as that builds, then you start to say, oh, it's this type of question, and I know I should look out for these types of things, and this is where I should look in the passage, and that, you have all this kind of test-specific knowledge that allows you to make faster decisions within the questions. But for that to work, there has to be kind of a solid foundation in the passage for the most part. Use your paper. I'm fanatical about how helpful using the paper or the whiteboard, depending if you're taking it in person or at home. Just, really just paying attention to those habits. I had a student who completely changed their quant score just by realizing that they should only do one question on their whiteboard at a time instead of doing 4. They were trying to do 4 and they were making a grid and cramming it in really small. And then they changed it. And now they just do one question at a time on the whiteboard. And it's, again, taking them from the 150s into the 160s, a huge jump. So, in quant, I think I used to think about this a ton, and I still do, but I think about it a lot in verbal now too, and when I'm thinking about using the paper in verbal, I'm not necessarily thinking about, I can show you, ooh, that's a great question, Catherine. I see your question. I'm going to come back to it. It's a good one. But just to show you, what my written work for verbal would be like, I'm going to have something about the main idea and the kind of paragraph structure of the passage: dogs versus cats, animals, why, whatever it is. But my notes are very minimal. Yay, cats. I'm using the paper primarily to force myself to pause, to think about what I've just read, and to synthesize it. And then I go on to the next. So now that the GRE has moved, we don't see the long passages so much. It's mostly short and kind of entirely short and medium passages now. Maybe you pause every like 2 to 3 sentences. Breathe. Process. No. And I'm using these notes to make sure that I'm paying attention and that I'm understanding. I am looking for the big picture, right? I want to know what the main argument is in the passage. If there is an argument, I want to know what the passage is about. And I want to know like roughly what goes where. So I'm maybe aiming for about 50% comprehension. But I want to be really solid in that 50%. I want to know this is a passage that somebody wrote to like argue about dogs versus cats and conclude that like pets are great or whatever it is. And then I want to know where to look when I'm asked about details. And then for each question, I will write down A, B, C, D, E. I do this always phonetically and verbal, and I will decide, is it definitely wrong or could it be true? And I'm often looking to narrow it down to two, and then I'll go back and I'll debate those two. Sometimes I narrow it down to one, but I also visualize and externalize my process of elimination. This helps me to make sure that I'm not rushing, that I'm not falling into traps, that I'm fully considering each answer. And in general, the more work that I outsource to the paper, the more I use the paper as like an extension of my short-term memory, the less I'm taxing my short-term memory, the less tired I'm going to be, the more energy I'm going to have. You know, I think especially in verbal fatigue, especially in that second verbal section, right? Fatigue is a big issue, as is mind wandering. So that's why I'm also using the paper to keep my mind from wandering. I got a really good question. Should I read the question first and then read the passage? Try both, play around with it. There's often going to be, if there's only one question associated with the passage, it's a short passage, it's a logic passage, absolutely always read the question first. If there's multiple questions, check, right? How many questions are associated with this passage? There's a little blue bar that'll tell you. If it's multiple questions, it's a little bit personal preference. Some people in a multiple question passage like to read that first question first. And some people I tend to go straight to the passage. Try both and see. One question passage, absolutely read the question first. So that's sort of general principles of timing. I want to talk a little bit about how do you get there, right? That's where we want to go. Things to think about as we're shaping a timing strategy. Practice. I think a big mistake that I see a lot, and it's a mistake, mistakes are great. We learn from our mistakes. We have to make a lot of mistakes to learn. So it's good to make a lot of mistakes in this process. But one mistake that I think just costs people time in the overall time horizon, right? That kind of slows down their overall preparation process is that they try to be fast from the beginning. And especially if you haven't done math in a while, you haven't taken a standardized test in a while, you don't read a lot, whatever it is, like, especially if there's anything that there's maybe some skill, some attention you need to put into it, don't try to learn something or relearn something and be fast at it simultaneously. Separate. So stage one, just be able to do the problems in a way that feels accurate, smooth, good written work, no errors, right? Like, first be able to do things well untimed. That can take a little time to get there, but give yourself some time for that. Then once you can do that, right? Then just notice, right? Get a little, I think it's nice to not have your phone around, for focus. So get a little timer, right? Get a little timer. And just notice it. How long am I actually spending reading? Notice, how long am I spending reading the passage when I feel good about my read? How long am I spending on each question? Then you can start to make some changes, right? Oh, I can see that this is a little slow, or, oh, I notice I'm spending a lot of time on the passage, but I can be faster on the questions. And I think if you have a good preparation in stage one on time, it's often not horrible when you discover how long things are taking. And then maybe you also learn that there's some things that are just always going to be super time consuming, and that can be a type of problem to go in the maybe don't do pile too. And then the next thing that you're going to do is you're going to then move into short timed set practice. So first, untimed, build skill, build foundation. Second, just for a week or two, notice. I think the second stage is sort of the shortest one. And then start to mix in short groups of timed problems, because we want to also be thinking about how we make trade-offs in timing between different types of questions, right? Like I was talking about earlier, I'm slow on QC, but I don't need to stress myself out with becoming fast in QC because I am fast in other ways that offset that. Overlooked way to get better at timing is to get faster at the stuff you already do well. And that's, we'll talk about that. Time set. I think, start with 3, then 5, then 7, then 10. If you can manage time well across 3 problems, then make it 5, then make it a little bit longer. I don't think I would rarely do more than 10 questions in a time set. I average 5 when I'm working with folks. Kaplan makes a really good tool for this, the QBank, that you can use. There's Magoosh has some time sets now that are licensed questions from ETS, which I think would also be good to use, especially maybe closer to test date. And then going into the set, pick one goal, one thing to focus on the level of process. I never want someone to be making goals about results, because if they're like, I'm going to get every question right, it's going to make things worse, because it's pressure. And we're never aiming for 100%, right? We're aiming for 60 to 80% correct for the most part. So I pick one goal. Maybe it's breathing. Maybe it's always noting what the question's asking for. Maybe it's good written work, whatever it is, that's your focus. And if you consistently do that, that's a win. And then go through and do the set. And then before you go into checking answers or getting into sort of the details of each problem, just take a little bit of time to reflect on the whole. Like, how did you feel? Where did you feel there was too much time, too little? Were you being too stubborn? And I would write this down. I would keep notes on this, because this will be very helpful to track your process over time, your progress over time too. Then go through, understand each question, learn something big, take a bigger takeaway or lesson from each question. Focus on, also look at things you got right, say, okay, I got this right. Could it have been faster? Could I fine tune anything in my written work? Those little, saving sort of 5 to 10 seconds here and there on problems that you already can do well can add up to, an extra problem right, or 2 extra problems right. And then you'll probably have a lot of things that come up in the set, especially if you're, newer in the practice. One thing to try differently next time, one adjustment, and then repeat with that adjustment. It's a little, this is often a game of iteration, slow adjustment, slow progress. So I think sometimes it's nice to do them in pairs, right? Do a time set, identify an adjustment, implement it, and see. But you could also do, one each day, depending on how much study time you have. And so usually what I see for folks who are newer studying, right, there's a period of maybe, 4 to 12 weeks where someone's building content foundations, learning the question types, learning the skills, learning the problem solving practices. Then there's a period where they start to notice time. It's maybe a couple of weeks. And then there's another period of, 4 to 12 weeks of this type of iterative time to practice, to build, both to sort of continue honing and building problem solving skills, but also to build these larger self and time management skills as well. Cool. So that's all of me talking at you, and then I want to answer questions, and I have one to start with that's really good. But just summing up, don't try to do every question. If you're trying to do every question, just take a practice test or time set. I often assign practice time sets where I'm just like, do 4 out of 5, do 2 out of 3. Graphs, in the graph sets, the data interpretation sets, right? There's almost always one of those 3 that's insanely hard. So I always tell people, aim to do 2 out of 3 of the graph questions. That's usually a great choice for managing time in graphs, especially if you don't like them. Be kind to yourself. The way you're talking to yourself in your head matters a lot in this too. Notice what stresses you out, what calms you down, play to your strengths, use that. Set it, if you're newer in the process, right, set a good foundation first before you worry about speed. Once you're ready for them, short time sets are the best tool for practicing and improving timing strategy. Cool. I'm going to answer some questions now. So please put your questions in the chat. Let me know. I'm gonna talk about them. And I have a great question. If you are taking the test this Friday, this week, in the near future, and you are in the mid 150s in quant, number one, do everything you can to be like as mentally sharp and rested and present as you can, so that you just don't make any small errors, right? It's like everything that you can get, you want to make sure that you get. I would say like probably there are going to be 2 questions in the first quant section that you should not do. So think about, you're going to aim for like 8 to 9 out of 10. and there's going to be 2 that you don't do, and then use that time to be super accurate on the others. In the second quant section, that's sort of mid 150s. You're sort of right at the cusp. Are you going to get a moderate second section or a hard second section? If you think it's hard, right? If you sort of get the sense, gosh, these problems are hard in the second quant section, then maybe there's 5 you don't do, right? And you're aiming for like, again, 8 or 9 out of 10, but there's going to be like 5 super hard ones that you just don't want to mess with. If you have the feeling, oh, this is kind of moderate, then maybe there's just 1 or 2 that you don't do in that second section. So that's I think the best, be super rested and then go in with this mindset of like, I'm going to do 10 out of 12. And then, maybe I'm going to do 13 out of 15. Maybe I'm going to do 10 out of 15, just seeing what you're feeling for that second section. Yeah, I mean, like, you read it, you maybe think about it for 30 seconds, you fill in a guess, and then you say, great, now I have an extra minute and a half, so I can afford to be like, steady, careful, fully executing on the things that I know I can do. And I would maybe even just sit and make a list before your test date of what are the things that are weaker that you want to be a little more skeptical of. Always give yourself some time to read and think about it, because sometimes the things that immediately look bad aren't, they do disguise difficulty. But I think that's my, looking to see a quick jump in score. That's the best thing I think that I can think of. Yes, I've gotten, you're so welcome. It's such a good question. And then if if you don't get where you want to be, and you can, you have time before your deadline, take it again. That's the other thing. I think the short test is a little more volatile. There's fewer questions. Each question counts more. There's a little bit more luck. I see people, I used to feel very confident, like if someone was scoring 158 on an ETS practice test, they'd probably score 156 to 160 on their official test. But now I think that range feels wider to me based on what I've seen in the last year. So also, if you can, sometimes it's worth just repeating 3 weeks later, and you'll have a different test. And there is luck maybe plays a little bit of a bigger role than it used to. That's my feeling based on this first year of the short test. So for timed sets, there's the Kaplan Q Bank. You can make your own. The Manhattan Prep 5-pound book has some in the back. I think that's also just a really good resource in general, because it has so many questions, every quant topic, easy to hard. So I like that also for kind of strategy and skill building work. Magoosh has ETS like licensed sets now that are, they're ETS made the questions and they're being offered through Magoosh. And they're timed and they're different difficulty levels. So I think those are interesting as a timed resource, time set resource for practice tasks. MPrep has, everyone has a free one, right? And you can do MPrep, you can do Kaplan. Then obviously the ETS Power Prep ones are the sort of best source. There's 2 free and 2 paid now, I think. And so I would say like maybe start with a free MPrep one if you haven't taken a practice test, in part because you'll be able to see question by question timing breakdowns, which are very helpful. Then closer to test date, the ETS ones are the best predictor of score. That's going to be the closest correlation probably between practice test and official test score. ETS, yes, I would definitely, for verbal in particular, right? ETS official guide, ETS verbal supplement. There's also a quant supplement. Those I think are must-haves. I think, if you're going to get 1 book, the official guide, if you're going to get 3, get these 3. If you're going to get 4, get the 5-pound book, I think is good. I think I'm a little wary of the short form videos. And I say this as someone who made a video course, a GRE video course. They can be very, like everyone makes them, right? Target, Greg Matt, Prep Swift. I think Prep Swift has some good stuff. I've been liking that. I really like MPrep Interact, but I worked on it, so I'm biased. but I think the really short form videos, just be careful that you're not just watching videos. I think they can be a great learning tool, but make sure that you're pairing them with plenty of actual question practice. The videos often give us the feeling of acquiring skill and knowledge, but we really need to drill that for it to sink in. So that's just something to watch for. And then in terms of where to go to learn the sort of core content, I think just what fits you. There's so many good options out there, and noticing, is it a book? I think the MPrep, all the quant, all the verbal books are good for that stuff. There's also a lot of good video content out there too. And then I got a great question, which was, is there a guide on how to go through the ETS guides? No, I wish there were. I don't think we have that. Someone should make that. These are for problems. This is something I do want to stress, right? These are great sources of problems. I don't think the explanations of content or the explanations of problems are great. So I would not go to the ETS materials to learn. If I'm like, oh, I really need to sort of get sharp with circles again and understand circles, I would go to, I would do MPrep Interact. You can do a free trial of that if you like it. I would do Prep Swift or whatever resource you like, get a book. But I would go somewhere other than the ETS materials for that stuff. I don't think that's their strength. Their strength is the problems. I wish there were a good guide for how to go through them. I will say off the bat, I think start with the sort of easy sets, then medium, then hard, right? I would say start with the easiest sets, then medium, then go to the paper practice tests. There are paper practice tests at the back of the official guide. There is also a new official guide coming out in the not too distant future. Go to the paper practice tests. Don't do them as practice tests, just to use them as question by question practice. And then, when ready, do the hard sets. Yeah, I wish there were a good breakdown of that. Cool. I think I've gotten through all of the questions. What other questions do we have? Nobody has questions. What is the most comprehensive free QC practice question resource? Oh man, what's good that's free? What's out there that's free? Where can you get a lot of free QC questions? Free trials, right? Yeah, like uh, I would like sign up, see who's offering free trials of things and sign up for their free trials, and then just do as many of the questions as you can in the free trial period. I think that's probably where I would go, especially if I just wanted something for like a couple days, right? And as a good resource. The other thing is these free prep hours are going back forever. You probably see like my whole 9-year career in them, are all on YouTube, right? And there's any topic you want has probably been covered at some point. So that's also, I think, a really good free source. A lot of them, mine don't include problems so much these days, but my old ones did, and my colleagues do. So you'll see a lot of problems in those. And then also just a lot of good teaching of different things, and almost any topic I think that you'd want some content on, you can find one. You'll have to sift maybe a little bit, but there's a lot of stuff in there, and that's, I think, also kind of a really good free resource. Vocab, yeah, I would say just like 10 to 15 minutes a day. The words that are being tested right now are not wild, so that's something to be careful of, right? With Kaplan, with MPrep, with a lot of the providers, not even with the ETS stuff, because it's changed, right? From the official guide has not changed in my 9 years here much, but the test has changed a lot. So what I'm seeing, and I see this in those Magoosh ETS questions, and then I saw this on the official test. I get a lot of, consistent reports, have for a couple of years. The vocab on the test trends more accessible every day. And I think continues to trend. So I think, and it's different, right? Like if English is your third language, maybe vocab is going to be like 20, 25 minutes a day. It's probably most important actually for feeling comfortable with the reading comp, more so than the answer choices and text completion and sentence equivalence. So, one thing is do one of the ETS power prep tests and just sort of notice how you feel about that vocab. Even that's probably going to be it's skewing hard. And then any method that you can do consistently, because I think the thing that matters most with acquiring vocabulary is slow and steady consistency over time. So, if an app is what's good for you, get an app and do 10, 15 minutes a day. If you're very motivated, do paper flashcards. But truly it's like, what can you keep up over a long period of time? And that's how I see people make big shifts in vocabulary, is they have, 3 to 9 months where they're working just a little bit every day. In person versus at home. Oh, and I also maybe wanted to touch on, if anyone, I'll touch on this, and then if there's any questions about GRE versus GMAT too, I work with GMAT people. I've taken the GMAT. I have thoughts about the difference. Everyone's different in person versus at home. I would think about your home environment. Do you have consistent, reliable internet? If you have internet that sort of occasionally likes to disappear. My internet used to go out when it rained heavily. It no longer does, but it used to. So I would not take the test at home on a rainy day, because I would know that wouldn't be good. Is it quiet? All those kinds of things. Where will you do best? For me, if I had to score qualify again, I would go to a test center because I'm a little lackadaisical at home. But I definitely have students who are going to the test center. It's too much anxiety, and at home they're calmer. At the test center, you'll be in a quiet room, but you'll be in a room with other people. People will come in and out. People are taking tests on different schedules. They do offer noise blocking, noise canceling headphones. You're so welcome. Have a good night. And I would also think about paper, just like white printer paper versus the erasable surface, a small whiteboard, and try and see. Some people really hate the erasable surface, and then it's a clear choice to go with paper. I found I found when I took the at-home test, I thought I was going to hate the erasable surface, and I didn't as much as I thought I would. So those are the things that I would think about in making that decision. And then sometimes people try one and they decide they didn't love it and they try the other. Also think about, where is the nearest test center? If you're, Midtown New York, is going to be very different from, being out in a quieter, more suburban, more rural area too. So I would also think about sort of where you are, where you might be, what type of test center you'd be at, because the test centers are not standardized experiences. I hear report, someone took the test in Illinois and they were like, my paper was green, and someone took it in California and they were like, my paper was pink, and I was like, my paper's always been white paper. So someone said it was blue. So you will get fluctuations in test centers too. And so if you're thinking for an in-person center, if you can find someone, like on Reddit, who's been to that center, and just hear a little bit about like what people's experiences at that specific center have been, that's also a really good thing to think about in making the decision, because they're not all the same. Yeah, you can use the GMAT. You can use the Manhattan GMAT yellow pad. You just have to cut one page out of it. I think that's what I used the first time I took that home test. So you can absolutely use that. I have a tiny whiteboard now, and like fine tipped markers. I think for me, it's the markers that are the biggest issue, getting the finest tipped erasable markers that I can. Yeah, and that's one thing to think about, right? With the erasable surface, when do you erase? Some people it's 2 problems, some people it's every problem, and you can use the erasing moment to like deep breath, reset, check time, So I think when I took the at-home test the first time, I was concerned that the erasing would be sort of distracting and weird, but I actually found it kind of helped me with pacing as I went through. Um, cool. And then last question before we go, GRE versus GMAT. Always the gold standard is to try both and see if you're thinking about it, do a practice test in each. But I would think specifically about the quantitative comparison compared to data sufficiency, do a couple QC, do a couple data sufficiency. There's similar-ish, right? Like if you've done data sufficiency, the type of thinking is somewhat similar. I think quantitative comparison is simpler strategically. So I would note that. I would try the data interpretation, the graph questions on the GRE. That's a GRE thing. I would look at the vocab questions. Keep in mind they're also reading questions. In some ways they're more about the reading than they are about the words these days. And then I would think about for many people who are stronger in verbal or less comfortable in quant. That's me. I hated math. It's an irony that I teach it now. I think the GRE is easier to manage the timing and strategy. I don't know that every single person would agree with me on that, but I think the majority of people that I've worked with would. So I think if you're thinking about switching from GMAT to GRE, mostly people like doing that. And truly schools, a 99th percentile GMAT score is a little bit more impressive than a 99th percentile GRE score for sure. I know my colleagues who are really good at GMAT are better at math than me. But outside of that, like very small specific bracket that is not necessary to get into any program, probably, there's no bonus points for GMAT. I think there was, I don't know if, I think it's still around a little bit, but there was a big sort of urban legend that you got bonus points for taking the GMAT, and I don't think you do. And all of the admissions consultants that I've listened to and spoken with over the years have affirmed that. Cool. All right. That is our time. Thank you so much for being here with me. I'm going to be back in September doing another one of these. I think the next one will be just more of my traditional open Q&A, but we'll see how the spirit moves me. Thank you for all your great questions. Appreciate you. Hope you have a good night and good luck if you were taking the test soon. I hope it goes great.